Okay, welcome back. This lecture is on the unconscious mind. So, the idea that we have unconscious psychological processes have fascinated people for a very long time. Even before modern psychology, philosophers and writers were interested in this idea of the unconscious. Um, but in psychology, you can really trace the, um, the popularity of studying the unconscious with Sigmund Freud. Um, and it was his notion that we have this unconscious mind that affects our thoughts, our feelings, and our behavior, as well as our mental health, that's really attributed to his work and that is credited with um, really kind of pushing forward the idea that the unconscious mind exists and that psychologists should study it. So most people don't accept many of Freud's ideas and theories anymore, many of which I'll talk about in this lecture, but he certainly did get something right, which is the basic idea that there's a lot that is going on in our brains, and our capacity to be consciously aware of it all is very small. And so it must be true that there's more to mental activity than just what we're aware of. There has to be an unconscious. So, indeed, unless you believe that our conscious awareness is completely disconnected from our other bodily processes and our other mental processes, you have to kind of accept that there's this thing called the unconscious mind. So that's a logical argument, but what I'm going to do in this lecture is also present empirical evidence, that is, actual research results that support the existence of an unconscious. So in this lecture, I'll first just distinguish between conscious and unconscious. I'll do a short biography of Freud and talk about some of his theories. Many of his theories involved the idea of the unconscious mind and unconscious processing, so I'll review some of those. Then I'm going to go over evidence for the unconscious in psychology, and so this will involve going over some early brain studies, talking about something called priming. I'll even get into subliminal priming, the idea that people can be presented with stimuli either visually or through music, like auditory, and without awareness, but there can be hidden messages, and these hidden messages can influence our behavior. So we'll go over that research, and hopefully you'll know at the end of this lecture whether subliminal advertising and messages would work. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about are implicit attitudes and implicit bias. So this is something that is very much in the public consciousness recently. And so I want to talk about the idea that we can have thoughts and feelings that we're unaware of, and this can influence our behavior, and particularly thoughts and feelings about other people that can be positive or negative, and that we can have these unconscious biases against people that could potentially affect our behavior. All right. So after watching this lecture, I hope that you'll be able to define consciousness and distinguish between high and low conscious states, know Freud's theory of the unconscious mind, know evidence in support of the unconscious mind, and then know what implicit attitudes are and how they're studied. First, what's consciousness? Let's just have a very kind of simple example of, if you can even remember the last time that you were in a grocery store, going through the aisle. Some of us make very conscious and deliberate decisions, looking at the back of the bags of chips and reading every ingredient. Okay, really just being aware and effortful and deliberative. Versus some people, it's like you're just pushing your cart, or you're holding your shopping basket and you're just going up and down the aisles, and it's like things just end up in the cart and you're like, how did that even happen? Like, what was controlling my decision making here? I don't even know, right? Like, you're putting it on the belt, and the checker is scanning it. You're like, how'd that get in my cart? Okay, so when we're talking about consciousness, we're talking about an awareness of self bodily sensations, thoughts, and of sensory inputs from the environment. Okay, so it's a high state of awareness of both what's happening inside of us as well as outside in the environment. In contrast, the unconscious or the unconscious mind consists of processes that occur in our mind which happen automatically without our awareness, and they're not available to our own reflection or introspection about them. Okay, so these can include different thoughts, these can include memories, this can include motivations, these can include interests. But there's these concepts that we have in our mind, even though we're not aware of them, but they can influence our other thoughts, feelings, or behaviors. All right, so let's talk about Freud, because he really was and is the most, well, he's not alive anymore, but he was the most famous advocate for the unconscious mind. So I've included a link here, and this goes to a YouTube, and on this video, the creator of the video also presents a short bio, and then also reviews one of his theories about child development that turns into adult personality. I'm going to review that as well, but that's what's in this link. So Freud was an Austrian neurologist and is credited with being the founder of psychoanalysis, which is a critical method for treating psychopathology through dialogue between a patient and a psychoanalyst. So by psychopathology, we just mean mental illness. He received his medical doctorate from the University of Vienna, and he later became an affiliated professor with the University of Vienna. For most of his life, he lived and worked in Vienna. He set up his clinical practice there, treated his patients, and that's where he developed his therapeutic technique of psychoanalysis. He was also a very prolific writer. He published more than 320 different books, articles, and essays. And it was in these writings that he shared his many thoughts and ideas about the human mind and mental pathology that were not only controversial, now, they were controversial at the time. However, they had a major impact on the growing field of psychology, and his influence continues to be felt today. So this is if you believe it or not, this is actually a short list of those books and publications. And I don't expect you to know these titles on the exams or the years, so I present this only to kind of convey what a prolific writer he was and some of the things that he wrote about, many of which you've likely already heard about without being in a psychology class. So, for example, his book Studies on Hysteria. Hysteria refers to overly emotional behavior. Okay, and so the book describes his work and study of a number of individuals who suffered from hysteria, or at least he diagnosed them with having hysteria, including one of his most famous cases, a young woman named Anna O, or who is known as Anna O. And so this book also introduced the technique of psychoanalysis as a treatment for mental illness. It turns out that in Freud's era, many women were diagnosed with hysteria, being overly emotional. And hysteria was actually a diagnosis that people could receive up until 1980. So basically in the manual for mental disorders that therapists and psychiatrists use, hysteria appeared in that manual up until about 1980. So that shows you the influence of Freud. He also wrote The Interpretation of Dreams, where it basically lays out his theory that dreams represent unconscious wishes that are disguised in symbols. Okay, in the psychopathology of everyday life, he discussed several errors that we make during our everyday life, including forgetting names or errors in speech, concealed memories. It was in this book that he talked about slips of the tongue, which are known as Freudian slips. This is basically some memory mistake or verbal mistake that is believed to be linked to the unconscious mind. So, for example, if you've ever called your current boyfriend or girlfriend by the name of your ex, you've made a Freudian slip. Potentially made a Freudian slip. Freud would say that there's some unconscious thoughts or feelings that you have about your ex, and that's, that's why it it was a slip of the mouth, and you called your current boyfriend or girlfriend that. Because these slips reveal the secret thoughts and feelings that people have. His book, 3 Essays on the Theory of Sexuality, is considered one of his most important works. So in the book, in these 3 essays, he outlines his theory of psychosexual development, which is basically that children go through a series of stages, psychosexual stages, that lead to the development of adult personality. So I'm actually going to describe that in more detail. He also wrote a book on narcissism, where he basically said that narcissism is normal. He wrote an introduction to psychoanalysis, where he outlines his theory of the unconscious mind and about psychological dysfunction, which is basically that chronic emotional distress and anxiety is due to the conflict between different unconscious desires. So I'll go over that as well. And so again, you're not responsible for knowing this list, but I just kind of wanted to, Freud is so well known. I just wanted to give you kind of a better sense of who he was, as well as some of his works. I do want to talk about his somewhat famous, not somewhat, very famous, theory of psychosexual development, because all of the goofy things that you may have heard, that some of you may have heard about Freud, really comes from this. And it's important too because, again, this lecture is about the unconscious, and so the role of the unconscious plays a major role in this theory, and then this theory plays a major role in understanding mental illness in adults. So I think that this is important to understand. So according to Freud, psychological development in childhood takes place during these 5 psychosexual stages: the oral, anal, phallic latency, and genital stage. They're called psychosexual stages because each stage represents the fixation of the libido on a different area of the body. So libido was a term that Freud used to describe the energy that's created by our instinct to survive as well as reproduce. So he said we have a survival as well as a sexual instinct. So according to Freud, the libido is the driving force behind all behavior. So the term libido has taken on more of a overtly sexual meaning. We often think of libido as being sex drive, but to Freud it represented all of the psychic energy that people had, not just sexual energy, but all of our motivation, our drive, our energy. Okay, and you can see, he was heavily influenced by Darwin and evolutionary theory. So you remember from previous modules that really Darwin suggested that we've got our main motivation as a species is to survive and reproduce. And so we see this with Freud's libido, is that our energy comes from our instinct to survive as well as to reproduce. So that's what he said. So going back to the stage theory, what he said is that as a child grows physically, there's certain areas of the body that become important as sources of either potential frustration or as sources of pleasure, or both. So each of these stages is associated with a particular conflict that has to be resolved before the child can successfully advance to the next stage, which is kind of characteristic of all stage theories. From a previous module, I talked about Piaget's theory of cognitive development, and that's characteristic of that stage theory as well, is that you kind of progress through these stages and you go to the next stage once you've been able to resolve a conflict or solve a problem. So it's the resolution of these conflicts at these stages requires the expenditure of this libido, this sexual energy, and the more energy that is expended at a particular stage, the more important the characteristics of that stage remain with the individual as they mature psychologically. Okay, so that's a basic idea. Now, the first stage, according to Freud, is the oral stage. And here, the libido, okay, right, that driving force, is centered on the baby's mouth. The libido is satisfied from the baby putting all sorts of things in its mouth. And indeed, much of a baby's life is oriented around oral activities like sucking and chewing and biting and breastfeeding. So Freud said that oral stimulation, however, could lead to an oral fixation later in life. And so he said that we could see oral personalities all around us, such as people that are smokers or nail biters or finger chewers, thumb suckers, and that people that weren't kind of able to successfully resolve all the things that they needed to resolve at this stage might revert to childhood behaviors like finger sucking, particularly when under stress. Or you might see older children do that, is going back to sucking their thumb when under stress. At the anal stage, the libido becomes focused on the anus, and the child derives pleasure from defecating, going to the bathroom. However, it's at this time that the child is now fully aware that they're a person in their own right. They have their own wishes and desires, but that brings them into conflict with the demands of others. So specifically, Freud believed that potty training was a source of conflict because children have parents that impose restrictions on them in terms of when and where they can go to the bathroom. Can't just go poop in their diaper or poop in their pants anymore. There's rules about when and how we go to the potty. He said it was the nature of this first conflict with authority that could determine a child's future relationship with all forms of authority. So specifically, early potty training or very harsh potty training, like having a lot of rules, could lead a child to becoming anal retentive, developing into an anal retentive adult. Somebody who hates mess, is obsessed with being tidy and clean, but then that would generalize to also being punctual, on time, respect for authority, etc. During the phallic stage, sensitivity now becomes concentrated on the genitals, and masturbation becomes a new source of pleasure. I personally couldn't believe it, so I'm a father of 2 children. One is 7 now, but when my kid was young, I forget how young, like 3, 4, somewhere right in this phallic stage. Yeah, he's playing with his junk. Couldn't believe it. But it's during this time that children become very aware of differences in anatomy between boys and girls. And this sets in motion conflict between, according to Freud, erotic attraction, resentment, rivalry, jealousy, and fear. Okay, so in boys, he called this the Oedipus complex. The name Oedipus complex derives from the Greek myth where Oedipus, who was a young man, ends up killing his father and marrying his mother. Upon discovering that he did this, he pokes his eyes out and becomes blind. So according to Freud, the Oedipus complex arises because boys develop sexual desires for their mother. Boys want to basically be with their mother exclusively and get rid of their father. Now, irrationally, boys think that if their father were to find out these hidden desires, their father would come after them and cut off their penis, and therefore boys develop castration anxiety. So according to Freud, how do little boys resolve this conflict? They do this by imitating, copying, and joining in the gender-prescribed masculine dad type activities and behaviors. And this is the process of gender role identification. And according to Freud, that's how they ultimately resolve their Oedipus complex. Okay, not appropriate to be with mom. I don't want to be afraid of dad. So what do? Is I actually identify with dad. So I don't know if there's anything to this, but I do recall a time when my son was, I'll place him right around 4 or 5, and he asked a question which many little children often ask, which was, he asked my wife, Mom, can you and I get married? Because he was aware of that concept. And so, my wife explained to him, no, we can't get married. I'm already married to Daddy. And then he said, Daddy, can we wrestle? So I don't know if there's anything. I really don't think that there's anything to this Freudian stuff, but my goodness, there's funny things that happen. So yeah, Daddy, can we wrestle? Now, for girls, it's a little bit more complicated as well as strange. So Freud said that girls at this stage develop anxiety when they don't realize that they have a penis. He called this penis envy. And he also said that, they feel resentment towards their mom because mom failed to provide their daughter with a penis. They end up not appreciating their mom because their mom appears to be castrated as well. But then girls have to repress these feelings, okay? And they ultimately end up identifying with their mother and take on the female gender role. So it's all very confused. But those are some of the things that Freud said. During the latency stage, there's no further psychosexual development because the libido is latent. It's dormant, sleeping, you could say. So Freud thought that most sexual impulses are repressed during this stage, okay, which that means that the libido is basically subdued and it is put towards schoolwork, hobbies, friendships, etc. Finally, at the genital stage, this is the last stage of the theory of development. It's a time in adolescence where there's sexual experimentation. Ultimately, he said that the libido is directed towards heterosexual pleasure. And so that successful resolution of this stage involves settling down in a one-to-one monogamous relationship and ultimately getting married. So, all right, so these were his ideas. And again, controversial now, controversial at the time. Most people don't give much credence to them. I mean, they're really kind of far out. The main points that I'd like you to remember about Freud and about this particular theory is that adult personality development is shaped by a child successfully or unsuccessfully navigating the conflicts that arise at these different developmental stages. Okay, there's this driving force that is the libido, but ultimately these sexual impulses of the libido get put in check by parents and the internalization of society's proper kind of norms of behavior and ways of behaving. Okay. Furthermore, though, if these conflicts aren't resolved, people continue to have these conflicts at an unconscious level. And it's these unresolved unconscious conflicts that are the basis for pathology and mental illness, at least according to Freud. So this brings us to kind of his further specification of his theory of the unconscious mind. So Freud believed that conscious awareness is only a small part of mental activity, just the tip of the iceberg in this iceberg metaphor. So the conscious level is all the thoughts that we're aware of. Then we've got the preconscious level just below the surface, that is all the content that is not currently in awareness, but could conceivably be brought into awareness. So we can think of the preconscious as our long-term memories. And then there's the unconscious, which is all of the things that our mind can't easily retrieve, which would be these hidden memories, hidden desires, hidden wishes. So the other aspects of the model that you'll see there are three structures of the mind: the id, the superego, and the ego. The id, the ego, and the superego. So the first structure, the id, exists completely submerged in our unconscious mind. The id operates according to the pleasure principle, which pushes us to seek pleasure and avoid pain. And it's the libido. The libido is the energy that drives this pleasure principle. So the id is according to Freud, is the most basic part of our personality. It represents our most animalistic urges, like our desire for food and sex. Okay, so it's the libido is our energy which acts on these impulses and desires. Okay, but we don't act on all of our impulses and desires because we have a superego. The superego is the brake on the id. So the superego also largely exists in our unconscious mind. The superego develops in childhood as the internalization of the standards of behavior that we learn from parents and society. So the ego then is the third structure that basically mediates the conflict between the id and the superego. So the id are all the things that we want to do, and the superego is all of the standards that we've internalized that tell us what we're allowed to do. And so the ego tries to satisfy the wishes of the id while being responsive to the superego. So the ego operates according to the reality principle, which involves rational thought and problem solving. So the ego also seeks pleasure and avoids pain, but it does this in a way that is basically creates a realistic strategy to obtain pleasure. So little kids are all id. Okay, if they want something, they'll just snatch it or grab it, and they cry and they scream and they'll just poop their pants, and they're just, right, they're id, according to Freud. But as we develop and we become more capable of rational thought and problem solving, we have a more well-developed ego. Okay, so for example, we'll go back to the grocery store. If you've ever gone shopping when you're just so hungry, you might have had the desire to say, I'm just going to open up this bag of chips right now and I'm going to eat it as I walk down the aisle. And indeed, I see some people doing that. But what, to kind of just describe the concepts, that even though we would have that impulse or the desire, our ego would come in, okay, especially this conscious part of the ego, and say, no, that's not really like normative. Most people don't do that. I might be looked at kind of funny. I'm just going to check out and I'm going to open it up as soon as I'm in the car. Okay, so that's your ego stepping in. Alternatively, you might get into a really heated argument with somebody and you just think to yourself, oh, I just want to like sock this person right in the face. That's our id, right? Our animalistic aggressive impulse. But of course we don't do that. We've internalized standards of conduct around not being violent or aggressive because that's not what society expects from us. And so we might, our ego very easily resolves that, which is to say, okay, I'm not going to punch this person in the face. I'm going to get in trouble for that. It's also not the appropriate thing to do, but maybe I'll cool off and maybe I'll plot my way to get my revenge in some other way. All right. So, anyway, this is Freud's theory of the unconscious mind, is that we've got our id, which is our animalistic desires, seeking pleasure, avoiding pain. It often comes into conflict with our superego, and we need our ego to resolve the conflict there. But those unresolved conflicts that we're unaware of because they happen in our unconscious would be the basis for pathology, and that he spent the majority of his career, you know, kind of expanding his theory about that. So Freud has been very heavily criticized. Number one, his theories are not scientific. It's not possible to measure his concepts of the libido, the id, the ego, the superego. They're simply not measurable. And you need to have measurable concepts in order to be a credible scientific theory. His theory is also based on explaining people's behavior kind of after the fact rather than being able to make predictions. So a lot of it is kind of backward looking. The reason you did this or the reason that you act this way is because of these imaginary structures that we can't see or measure, versus being able to predict what people will do in the future. So a good characteristic of any scientific theory is that it should be able to predict behavior in advance. His theory simply can't do that. His theory is also based on case studies, not empirical research. So he studied his patients, and there were very few of them. He studied himself. Much of the theory, it is thought, comes from his own introspection about his own childhood. So Freud was one of his own patients, and a lot of his theories and insights about the human mind came from introspecting about himself. His theory is also based on people's recollection of their childhoods and how their parents treated them, versus he didn't actually observe children. Okay, so there's that. And it's likely that because he used this method, he picked particular cases or particular stories or anecdotes that fit his theory and excluded the ones that didn't. More specifically to his theory of psychosexual development, it focuses very exclusively on male heterosexual development. And I think a main reason for that is because he did a lot of self-study. So he created theories to kind of describe his own development. So did he get anything right? Well, actually Freud is less well known for the more reasonable idea that unconscious thoughts form the basis of our conscious thoughts. Okay? So that's not a very controversial idea as well, at all. In fact, this view was shared by early psychologists, such as the father of psychology, Wilhelm Wundt. So Wundt said this: "Our mind is so fortunately equipped that it brings us the most important basis for our thoughts without our having the least knowledge of this work of elaboration." He went on to say, "Only the results of it become conscious. This unconscious mind is for us like an unknown being who creates and produces for us and finally throws the ripe fruits in our lap." So in other words, we might become consciously aware of things like how our food tastes, or how beautiful a painting is, or even feeling a pain after we stub our toe. But these perceptions and conscious thoughts are prepared somehow and somewhere in our brain before we're actually consciously aware of them. Okay? And again, I said this at the top of the lecture. Unless we're prepared to believe that conscious awareness is completely disconnected from all of our bodily and mentally processes, then our awareness has to be preceded by other processes in our brain that are unconscious. Okay, so again, that's a logical argument, but what I'd like to do now is present some actual research from psychology that is supportive of the role of the unconscious mind. So first, let's go to brain studies. So the idea that we unconsciously prepare for an action before we're conscious of that action was tested actually many decades ago. Kornhuber and Decke, back in 1965, did experiments in which they asked participants to perform a very simple action, which is just to flex their finger. They hooked their participants up to an EEG, an electroencephalogram, which is pictured here. This is not somebody in the study. This is just a picture of an EEG. And what they wanted to do is just investigate when the brain started to prepare for action. Their results suggested the first sign of brain activity preceded the action of flexing the finger by about 800 milliseconds, which is an eternity when it comes to neural activity. Okay, so this actually led other psychologists to wonder whether conscious awareness of the decision to act appears just as long or even longer in advance. Okay, so what Kornhuber and Decky didn't quite get among their participants is when their participants reported actually being aware that they had the thought to flex their finger. Okay, so that's what Libet did with his research. So he kind of replicated the paradigm of Kornhuber and Decky, but he added another measure, which is conscious awareness of the decision to act. So he did this. So the procedure was this. He would ask participants to sit at a desk, and at a desk there was this special timer. Okay, so they got hooked up with an EEG, so you could look at the brain's electrical activity, and then they instructed the subject to carry out a very simple task, like pressing a button within a certain time frame. Now, no limits were placed on the number of times that a subject could perform the action of pressing the button within a period. Now, during the experiment, the subject would be asked to note the position of a dot, pictured here, on a timer. Okay, so they said, just look at the dot on the timer when you're first aware of your wish to act. And they did, some tests and they were able to say, like, participants were able to do a pretty good job at being able to do that. They then pressed the button, right? And so pressing the button also recorded the position of the dot on the timer, okay? So they were able to note the position, press the button, and then they actually press the button, which would stop the dot, and then they're able to look at the difference between saying, hey, this is when I was consciously aware, this is when I actually pressed the button, and they're able to get a measurement of how much time that was. And so what they determined is that subjects reported awareness of their decision to act about 200 milliseconds before acting. But keep in mind, they're also hooked up to an EEG. And so by analyzing the EEG recordings, it was noted that there was brain activity primarily in the motor cortex that occurred about 500 milliseconds before the pushing of the button. So what that shows there is that there's brain activity at 500 milliseconds before pushing, but only conscious awareness at 200. So this is showing that there's brain activity related to pressing the button as many as 300 milliseconds before subjects first reported awareness of their wish to act. Okay, so conscious decisions to act were preceded by an unconscious buildup of electrical activity. So, some early brain studies showing that when we engage in a behavior, there's brain activity before we're consciously aware of our desire to engage in that behavior. All right, let's go over another concept that's been used to support the idea of unconscious processing. So this is the concept of priming. So priming is the idea that our recent or current experiences, passively, that is, without our conscious awareness, create an internal readiness for a specific thought, feeling, or action. So it's the idea that viewing, hearing, or experiencing one stimulus can influence subsequent responses to some other stimulus. This works by activating associations in memory. So the prevailing model of how our memory works is that our mind is an associative network. Okay, and so and you've got an associative network pictured here. And so the way that our mind works and the way that our memory works is that when two things, like bacon and eggs, are thought about simultaneously, they become linked in memory. Subsequently, when one thinks about bacon, eggs are likely to come to mind as well. In this particular example, the concept of McDonald's is related to several concepts like food, hamburger, but also things like meat eating and veganism, or even things like love, comfort. So in this associative network model, memory is construed as this network of cognitive concepts, okay, objects, events, ideas, that are all connected by links. And these links reflect how strongly associated any pair of concepts is. Okay, so these models commonly incorporate the idea of spreading activation. So concepts that are currently being thought about are activated, and then excitement, activation spreads down the connecting pathways to associated concepts. So thinking about McDonald's then excites these other concepts, and we can keep going down the links in the chains. So just by thinking of McDonald's, okay, and how that's food can make available in one's mind these other concepts. All right, so there's different types of priming. There's semantic priming. This is the idea that words that are associated in a logical or linguistic way that words are associated in a logical or linguistic way. So in semantic priming, a word like table can activate the concept of chair. A word like dog can activate the concept of wolf because they're in the same semantic categories. They share features. Associative priming is where we've got like a target word that has a high probability of appearing with the prime because they're associated in our mind even though they aren't part of the same semantic category. So dog is an associated prime with cat since these words are closely related even though they're not part of the same semantic category. And then perceptual priming involves stimuli that have similar forms. So for example, the word goat is likely to evoke a faster response when preceded by the word boat, goat, because they're perceptually similar, even though they have very different meanings. So those are just a couple examples, and there's many other types of priming, but those are just some examples. So let me try to do a couple demonstrations to see how this works. So first, let me say, why don't you try to unscramble the following words? So try this one. There's a word there. See if you can rearrange the letters and make a word. Try the second one, and then try the third. Okay, so the first one was flower, the next one was rose, and the third one was stem. Now I'm going to give you another word that's scrambled up. Try to unscramble it. Okay, try to unscramble this word. You might have unscrambled the word as petal. Another possibility would be plate. But when psychologists do these types of studies, what they find is that there's a higher likelihood of unscrambling these letters to form the word petal when it's preceded by the word list, because what's just been primed here? The concept of flower, right? So through the associative network spreading activation, petal becomes, and other flower-related concepts become more active. Okay, so if you came up with plate, big deal. That's, it's a more common word. The idea would be that if you take people that were given the flower words beforehand and those that weren't, there's still some likelihood that people are going to say plate. There's still some likelihood that people are going to say petal, but more people will unscramble the word petal if first given the flower words. How about this one? Just read this list of words out loud to yourself. I'll read it out loud. Night, moon, sleep. Now what I want you to do is complete this word. What word did you come up with? Did you come up with the word dark? Well, if priming worked, that would be a likely way to complete that word, right? Because we had night, moon, sleep. And of course, we sleep at night when it's dark. There's other possibilities, of course. Doc, dork, dank. But priming the concepts of sleeping at nighttime would make people more ready to complete the word using an associated concept. All right, now you might be thinking, what's so unconscious about that? After all, I'm reading those words and, it was kind of easy to tell that there were certain concepts that were primed. Like I was aware of the concept that was being primed. Okay, well, let's take a look at this study. So this is a very well-known study in social psychology done by Barge and colleagues in 1999. What they had their participants do was a sentence unscrambling task. The participants' instruction was to write a grammatically correct sentence using only 4 of the 5 words. Okay, so this first item, we see the words from, are, Florida, oranges, temperature. And you could just create a sentence along the lines of oranges are from Florida. Okay, and it's only possible to make a single sentence that makes sense out of the 4 out of the 5 words. Okay, replace the old shoes. So that's how it works, and people get instruction on how to do that. Now, within these word choices, there are primes that are embedded. So if we look across the different items, we see the primes: Florida, old, bingo, forgetful. What's being activated here in our associative network is the concept, or the stereotype even, of an older or elderly person. Now, here's what's kind of amazing in this study. They had half of their participants do a sentence unscrambling task where they're primed with the concept of the elderly. The other half of participants did a similar sentence unscrambling task, but they did not get any specific prime. So they did the same activity, it's just you had half of the people got these elderly primes and half didn't. What they then had people do is, after they're finished with that part of the study, they were told to walk down the hall and deliver their worksheet to a research assistant. Now, as they did this, they were secretly monitored to see how long it took to walk down to that person. Here's the results, which they replicated across 2 experiments. So they found that participants who received the elderly primes walked slower, right? Here's the walking time. It took them 8 seconds, 8 and change, to walk down the hall, whereas participants that didn't get the elderly primes walked faster, a little over 7 seconds. Okay. Now, they said this was an example of unconscious priming, unconscious behavioral priming, because they went through a very elaborate debriefing process where they asked the participants, what do you think the purpose of the experiment was? What do you think this experiment was trying to study? Do you think any of the tasks that we had you do were related? If anybody said yes, how? How do you think they were related? Do you think that you did anything on one task that affected you on the other? So they go through a very elaborate protocol to try to probe people for suspicion or awareness. Turns out, at least what they report in their research, none of the participants realized or recognized that the first sentence unscrambling task had anything to do with old people or the elderly. So they made the argument that it was possible to activate this stereotype, this concept. Of course, we know that old people walk slow, right? If you've been kind of missing the punchline. So, and it was actually that concept being activated that then had an influence on people's actual behavior. So when this study came out, it was pretty mind-blowing to the field. And in fact, you can see when they published the paper, whoever accepted the paper made them basically do their experiment twice, probably because they said, we don't believe it, do it again, right? These are kind of unbelievable results. Well, some amount of skepticism was probably warranted, because it turns out that a set of researchers tried to replicate this exact same experiment, and they couldn't. Interestingly, using an automated timing method, a larger sample, they tried to replicate as closely as possible the original study, couldn't do it. Then what they did is they came up with another study, and what they wanted to do was say, hey, could this have been in the mind of the experimenters? So of the experimenters that ran the study, half were led to think that the participants would walk slower when primed with the elderly prime, and the other half was led to expect the opposite, and they ended up getting that walking speed effect, but only when experimenters believed that the participants would walk slower. I wonder what's going on. Okay, so this was actually the failure of this study to replicate, as well as some other notable studies, led to something in social psychology in particular, and psychology more broadly, as a replication crisis. People freaking out and having all these findings from psychology and not knowing what to trust because the original studies were, they didn't replicate. So what we have here is an article in Science Magazine from David Meyer, well-respected psychologist. And basically what he says, hey, look, that behavioral priming stuff doesn't replicate, but semantic priming, very highly reliable phenomenon. So if you get an English reader who's primed with a word like dog, they're going to be 10 to 20% faster at responding to a word like cat. This has been demonstrated repeatedly. This is widely believed to be a reliable phenomenon. What hasn't been replicated successfully is this behavioral priming of the variety of the Barge and colleagues with this elderly slow study. What he says in the paper here, and actually the entire little article is presented right there, but he's basically saying what social psychologists are trying to do is present the word dog and then see if that inclines adult heterosexual males to go to a brothel, because the brothel is nicknamed as a cat house sometime, and like minutes after being exposed to the word. Like, it's crazy. Who would think that that would work? But that's kind of what social psychologists are trying to do with some of these behavioral priming studies. So priming works, but it works most effectively when the two stimuli are really presented in the same modality. So those sentence completion tasks, filling in the blank, unscrambling a word, it really works because you've been given a list of words, and then you allow that prime to influence your response on a very similar task right away. Okay, and that works without people's conscious awareness, and it's a very reliable effect.